Lawrence Taylor, the name that sent shivers through the NFL, dubbed the Monster of Defense, completely transformed the history of American football. Born not to be coddled, he stormed into the NFL in 1981 like a hurricane, and no one was ready for that force. In his rookie season, Taylor did what no one had ever done. He claimed both the Defensive Rookie of the Year and the Defensive Player of the Year titles. 6 years later, he seized the league's MVP award, a feat rarely achieved by a linebacker. With 2 Super Bowl championships alongside the New York Giants, 10 Pro Bowl selections, and his 1999 induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, he became an eternal symbol of ferocity, speed, and genius. On the field, he was the embodiment of controlled chaos. His charge was enough to make the most renowned quarterbacks blanch. Bill Parcells called him the purest instinct football has ever seen. From 1981 to 1993, Lawrence Taylor wasn't just a player, he was the definition of fear, the only man who forced the entire league to adapt to protect itself. But time, drugs, and long lightless nights gradually unraveled that god within a mortal body. At 66 he walks slowly, carrying not just decades of injuries, but the weight of a past riddled with addiction and arrests. His body is a map of scars, his soul a battlefield never at peace. Some nights he wakes in a cold sweat, hands trembling, fearing his heart might stop before he can say sorry. Yet in his weakest moments, Lawrence's will to survive flares up, the same instinct that made him a legend. He's not chasing glory, he's just trying to be human. In the darkness of illness and loneliness, he still rises, slow, shaky, but resolute, the same way he rose after every hit back then. Williamsburg, Virginia, the late 60s, early 70s. A place thick with the smell of factory smoke and the sweat of black laborers, toiling in an America still steeped in segregation, poverty, and cold indifference to those not born into privilege. In an old wooden house on a dusty red road, Lawrence Taylor grew up in a world where respect was never given, it had to be earned, with blood, bone, and by making others fear you more than they despised you. His father, Clarence, was a shipyard worker, his back hunched early from heavy labor, hands calloused, skin cracked like charred wood. He didn't talk much, but a single glance was enough for his son to know mistakes meant pain. His mother, Iris, was a teacher, strict, disciplined, loving her son in a way no one recognized as love. No hugs were given, no "I'm proud of you" ever spoken. In that house, praise was a luxury, and silence was the reward. Lawrence grew up in a colorless, tasteless kind of love, surrounded only by the sound of his father's slippers on the floor, his mother's lessons, the wind rattling the windows, and the sting of his back when punished. In Williamsburg, soft emotions were taboo. A boy wasn't allowed to cry, to be weak, to back down. If hit, you hit back. If scorned, you made them fear you. Lawrence learned this earlier than most kids. The wiry, hyperactive, loud black kid, always in trouble, fighting, getting expelled, labeled wild. When a teacher said, "He has no future," Clarence's cold reply was, "He'll learn his way, or he won't survive." And so Lawrence learned. He learned that if the world wouldn't give him a place, he'd smash one open. He learned that fear was the only weapon the poor could wield to make others step back. If you want to survive, you have to be scarier than the fear trying to swallow you. That saying, like a soldier's command, became his lifelong compass. In the schoolyard, he wasn't the smartest or the best, but he was the one who never backed down. He fought like it was his last battle, each punch a declaration, "I exist." The more he was punished, the tougher he got. The more he was disciplined, the more he rebelled. One day, the school football coach saw him run, saw the explosive power in his legs and the fire in his eyes. "This kid doesn't need to be taught how to hit, just where he's allowed to," he said. That was the first time Lawrence touched a football. The first collision, the metallic crack of helmets like lightning, the air torn apart, the sound of a body crumpling to the grass, was like a birth. "The first time I was allowed to use my anger without being punished," he later recalled. From that day, football became the only place he felt he wasn't wrong. In every tackle, he found his voice. In every hit, he heard his heartbeat, the only sound proving he was alive. He didn't dream of being a star, he only dreamed of not being invisible. At the University of North Carolina, Lawrence Taylor exploded. Initially placed on the defensive line, then moved to linebacker, and instantly he was like a beast released into the wild. He played by no playbook, followed no rules, only instinct. He doesn't defend, he hunts, a teammate recalled. Every game was organized madness. Every hit was a small explosion. He leaped over linemen, crashed into opponents like a bullet, crushing everything in reach. They called him the Freak, the walking nightmare. But to Lawrence, it wasn't a title, it was validation. For the first time, the world praised him for the very thing it once condemned, his violence. He learned to speak through pain, to find peace in collisions. His coach asked, "Are you ever scared?" "No. I'm only scared when there's no one left to hit." That answer, half joking, was the manifesto of his life. He wasn't the prodigy celebrated from childhood type. He was the product of adversity, sweat, and thousands of silent hours forging his body. Every morning, he ran until his lungs burned, until his heart ached, until he felt himself dissolving in his own breath. No father waited at the finish line, no one said, "Good job." Just crickets, and the smell of damp earth. But in that solitude, he learned he didn't need cheering. He became his own engine. North Carolina witnessed the birth of something unprecedented, a defensive player who could control an entire game with sheer will. He didn't chase the ball fled from him. He didn't play to win, he played to survive. In every tackle, he heard his childhood, his father's clenched jaw, his mother's "don't be weak." That rage, channeled through Lawrence Taylor's legs, became speed, power, unstoppable force. To him, football wasn't a game anymore. It was religion. It was the one place he could hurt, erupt, be himself without judgment. But deep inside, even as he triumphed, a quiet truth was forming. All that strength, speed, thunder, wasn't a gift. It was the other side of a soul suppressed too long. Lawrence Taylor wasn't born to be loved. He was born to take hits, to hit back, to make the world remember him through impact rather than words. And so, football, the thing that saved him from being lost, also planted the seed of his tragedy. Because when the final game ended, when the whistle fell silent and the lights went out, Lawrence lost, not just a job, but his identity. He didn't know who he was without the armor, without the sound of collisions, without the pain. And what happens to a man who only knows how to live through violence when there's no one left to fight? Lawrence Taylor's tragedy began the moment he became great, because from then on, he no longer knew how to live as an ordinary human. 1981, that draft day, the name Lawrence Taylor rang out as the second pick, and America held its breath. He didn't enter the NFL as a rookie, he came as a storm. Analysts called him a phenomenon. Quarterbacks started losing sleep, and in his first season, he changed history, claiming both Defensive Rookie of the Year and Defensive Player of the Year, something no one had ever done. Lawrence Taylor didn't walk into the NFL, he kicked the door down. By 1986, he reached the unimaginable 20.5 sacks, the MVP title, unheard of for a linebacker. 2 Super Bowl titles followed, cementing him as a legend, and the Hall of Fame was just a formality for the obvious. He was the fear of an entire generation. On the field, Lawrence Taylor was a hybrid of man and tempest. Every tackle was an explosion, every pursuit a collision of human and primal instinct. He played with a cracked ankle, torn shoulder, broken fingers, aching back. Blood seeped through white tape, painkillers became fuel to keep going. Once a doctor urged him to rest 2 weeks for a torn muscle. He replied, "I'll rest when they turn off the stadium lights." He went out, shoulder dangling, made 3 tackles, forced a fumble, then collapsed to the roar of the crowd. That image, a bleeding man charging at his opponent, captivated America. No one saw the destruction happening inside. He was the only man who could force a team to rewrite its playbook just to stop him. One man, Bill Parcells, said, "He doesn't play defense, he instills fear." Bill Belichick called him a natural phenomenon you can't coach. Teammates didn't dare joke with him. Opponents wouldn't meet his eyes. When he stepped onto the field, the stands shook. When he fell, tens of thousands held their breath. He was like an ancient god, fueled by human screams. But that strength didn't come from talent, it came from rage, forged into steel. Lawrence once said, "I played like every game was my last," and maybe deep down, he believed it. Yet behind that light was the smell of drugs, alcohol, and overdosed adrenaline. When games ended, Lawrence couldn't sleep. His body craved the rush, his brain the sound of impact. He turned to cocaine, at first to dull the pain, then to feel alive. "I needed something to keep me high, like the crowd, like the pain, like winning," he admitted. And so began sleepless nights, booze, drugs, hallucinatory laughter. He stepped into a spiral, not knowing if he was falling or flying. The media called him the god of fear. Fans both worshipped and dreaded him. To them, Lawrence Taylor wasn't human anymore. He was a force, a raw instinct wrapped in flesh. He enthralled Reagan's America, bold, reckless, winning at all costs. But at the same time, America saw itself in him, blazing, brilliant, then slowly self-immolating. On the field, he held his head high, smirking at crushed opponents. Off the field, he shrank into dark rooms. Every morning, his body felt stabbed by 100 knives. Yet he trained, played, charged into battle as if he couldn't die. "If I still hurt, it means I'm still alive," he said. He saw pain as proof of existence. When you don't know how to be loved, you learn to be feared. And Lawrence Taylor chose that path, becoming fear itself to never fade away. Every tackle, every cheer, every stadium light was a dose of spiritual dope. But at night, when the lights dimmed, the emptiness in his chest grew. He began to believe he was immortal, untouchable by rules, fate, or pain. That's when the real tragedy began. When a man believes he's a god, he steps dangerously close to self-destruction without fear of consequence. Lawrence Taylor reached that edge, where glory and ruin blurred, where cheers became hallucinations, where painkillers weren't just for physical wounds, but to hide a fracturing soul. He kept playing, kept winning, kept being celebrated. But each victory took a piece of him, and America, in its collective frenzy, kept cheering, kept seeing him as a symbol of strength, not realizing that symbol was burning out under the lights. At 30, Lawrence Taylor had it all: fame, money, power, immortality and history. But at that age, in silent nights, he began to hear the crackle of fire in his heart, the fire that fueled a legend, and would eventually consume the man who created it. No one should be that strong, not even him. The addiction didn't wait for Lawrence Taylor to hang up his helmet. It came earlier, slipping into every crack of victory, every bruise that hadn't healed yet. While he was still wearing number 56, while America was still chanting his name in cheers, the darkness had already crept into his breath. He played on Sunday, snorted on Monday, sobered up by Wednesday, then back on the field Thursday, like nothing happened. To him, cocaine wasn't a sin, it was medicine, fuel for a machine running on empty, a substitute breath for sleep. When adrenaline wasn't enough to keep him standing, cocaine did the rest. He believed he had control, he believed everything was still in his hands, but really, he was just letting go without knowing it. The house in New Jersey, once where he and his wife, Linda, nurtured their early days of fame, gradually turned into a brutal resupply station. The dining table full of liquor bottles, the floor scattered with cigarette ash, the living room heavy with smoke and chemicals. The young children learned to stay silent when they heard the door slam early in the morning, learned not to ask Mom why Dad didn't come home overnight. Linda once said, "He came home like a stranger. Sometimes he looked at me like he was looking through a wall." Lawrence Taylor was no longer the family man. He became a ghost wandering his own house, leaving footprints of a legend burning itself out. The nights of disappearance chained together. He left when the city was still lit up, and only returned at dawn, eyes bloodshot, breath reeking of cheap booze, clothes wrinkled, and a tired smile. Friends said sometimes he sat alone in his car, took a deep hit, blasted the music, and yelled his name in the mirror, as if to confirm he was still alive. Missed calls from teammates, broken promises, forgotten family appointments. The price of glory was no longer sweat, it was a soul eroded night by night. Teammates never forgot the morning he showed up to a team meeting, still bearing handcuff marks on his left wrist. He'd been arrested for driving under the influence, falling asleep in his car on the roadside, but the next morning he was there on time. The coach looked, then turned away. Everyone knew, but no one dared speak, because he still took the field, still did what no one else could. In that world, winning was religion, and Lawrence Taylor was the immortal god, even if that god was rotting right before their eyes. The NFL fined him, the press wrote about it, but nothing changed. He got suspended, came back, played, shone, then fell again. The media called him the untamable monster, and he just laughed. Yeah, because I never wanted to be tamed. But behind that laugh was a depleted soul. He no longer knew fear. He no longer knew how to pity himself. Death was no longer scary, just an option on the list. Some nights, Lawrence Taylor collapsed on the cold steel-like bathroom floor, his face pressed against the tiles, heart pounding chaotically, head spinning, breath ragged, hands trembling violently. In the flicker between wakefulness and oblivion, a thought flashed like lightning. If this is death, will anyone notice in time? No fans, no teammates, no cameras, no applause. Just the sound of his heart, dripping water, and the shadow of the man who once made America boil, now shivering in solitude. He had conquered everything except himself. Linda said once, in the middle of the night, she woke up and saw him sitting in the living room, eyes red, hands shaking, staring at the jersey hanging on the wall. He was talking to it, she said, like it was the only one still listening to him. On nights like that, the house was no longer a home. It was an unlocked prison, where he was trapped with his own past. Fans still cheered, still wore number 56, still shouted his name in bars, but they didn't see the real scene. They didn't smell the sweat mixed with cigarette smoke, didn't hear the raspy cough every morning. They didn't know that after every game was a sleepless night, after every legendary tackle was another pill, another cut. What had America cheered for? The team's victory, or the slow suicide of a flesh-and-blood man? Once a reporter asked, "Are you afraid of losing everything?" Lawrence laughed, a tired but arrogant laugh. "I never had anything to lose except myself." That answer sounded like a joke, but it was the deepest tragedy, because indeed, everything off the field, fame, money, family, friends, was foreign to him. He only knew how to exist in the roar and the flash. Without them, he didn't know how to live. In 1988, he was suspended for a season for testing positive for drugs. The whole country was shocked. But when he returned, he immediately pulled off miracles, like a beast just released from its cage. That comeback wasn't a victory. It was proof he couldn't exist outside addiction, whether drugs or adrenaline. Lawrence Taylor was the man who brought fear to the entire NFL, but the one thing he could never defeat was the fear inside himself. Fear of silence, fear of stillness, fear of living an ordinary life. By the late 80s, as his career started declining, Lawrence still wouldn't stop. He played with a shredded body, a confused mind, a tired heart, and sunken eyes. He played like he owed someone an apology, maybe his father, maybe his mother, maybe the child once forgotten in that wooden house in Williamsburg. And in every final tackle, people no longer saw glory, just a man trading his soul to hold on to the feeling of existence. In the collective madness of American football, Lawrence Taylor became a symbol both loved and pitied. But in the quiet nights, when the medals gathered dust, all that remained was heavy breathing, and the question no one dared answer. What did we applaud? A team's victory, or the slow death of a human being? And if football is religion, then Lawrence Taylor was the saint sacrificed while still alive. After retiring, Lawrence Taylor thought the addiction would leave with the final whistle at MetLife, that when he hung up his helmet, the demons would leave him too. But they didn't. They waited in the darkness, like a patient beast stalking prey, only lunging when the lights went out to bite again. No more field, no more training schedule, no more roaring crowds. Lawrence thought he was free, but it was just an illusion. In reality, he was chained to the very thing that once sustained him: adrenaline, drugs, the thrill of trading his life. The slow death continued, only now no one paid to watch. He entered the 1990s like a man with amnesia, not knowing who he was, only knowing to chase familiar sensations. And so, the first arrests appeared. cocaine, alcohol, cars speeding through the night and stopping on the roadside. He was arrested for DUI, for leaving the scene after a crash, for possessing banned substances. His name, once introduced with cheers, was now read on the 11 p.m. news in a dry, cold reporter's voice. Lawrence Taylor, former Hall of Fame linebacker, has just been arrested. He was no longer a legend. He was news, a headline to click on, a face fallen from the throne. With each arrest, America nodded, sighed, then changed the channel. And Lawrence still didn't understand why he was still breathing. He tried to quit, tried to hide, but every time he thought he'd escaped, addiction found its way back. It didn't need football to exist. It only needed him. By 2010, the worst happened. An arrest no longer just about drugs or alcohol, it was a moral indictment. He was accused of soliciting prostitution from an underage girl. Police raided a hotel room in Rockland County. The press exploded. America was stunned. The man once hailed as a symbol of strength, discipline, warrior spirit, was now dragged into the street, head bowed, amid flashing cameras and blinking red lights. His face wrinkled, haggard, trembling, appeared on every news channel. No more number 56 jersey, no more stadium lights, just gray clothes, tired eyes, and the cold reading of charges. Patronizing prostitution, involving a minor, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, misconduct, and was sentenced to probation, years of supervision, required to register as a low-level sex offender. The court made it clear. The press made it clear. And America heard it clear. The world seemed to witness a public execution, but no one died. Just a man once called a living weapon of destruction, now bowing before a judge, hands clasped in front like pleading for something nameless. That image, replayed over and over on TV, in papers, online, a symbol stripped bare. No more medals, no more jersey, no more glory, just the sound of judgment. For Simon Cowell, scandal was just a crack in the image. For Lawrence Taylor, it was a permanent label etched into his skin. It wasn't just a case, it was the moral sentence America passed on its own former hero. The name Lawrence Taylor, from then on no longer just evoked Super Bowl Daxatwant or the historic tackle in 1986. It was tied to offender. A stamp he had to carry for life. And cruelest of all, America witnessed it all, not through stadium lenses, but through courtroom ones. The public split in two, half outraged, demanding his name be erased from all honors, from the Hall of Fame. They said, he once instilled fear on the field, now he instills disgust off it. The other half, silent heads bowed, in pain, not defending but mourning. They saw a man who once offered his body as a gift to the audience, now turned into news fodder for stoning. They saw the god they built now tied in the square, cheered as he was toppled from his throne. Throughout it all, Lawrence Taylor didn't justify. He just said, voice hoarse and weary, I am an addict, I made mistakes, I'll have to live with them. A confession not seeking forgiveness, but accepting slow execution amid the crowd. The press wrote thousands of articles, each like a small knife cut. Images of him in prison garb spread across the net. Morning sports shows debated, should we strip his Hall of Fame title, as if his downfall was the new act in mass entertainment. On forums people mocked, photoshopped, added emojis, laughed. No one thought of the human behind it. A man who traded everything so they had something to watch. Now they watched him, like another episode of American tragedy. Linda, his ex-wife, said in an interview, he doesn't need more punishment, he punishes himself every day. And indeed the sentence didn't end in court. It followed him out of the courtroom, into his sleep, into every stranger's glance on the street. Every time someone recognized him, his heart skipped a beat. The man once applauded by crowds, now feared human eyes. He went everywhere with his head down. Years later, he was still called the fallen giant, the toppled colossus, but what few realized was, he was never allowed to stand up again. This wasn't a scandal, this was a public crucifixion, where the nailed man doesn't die, just lives on, bearing the shame like a permanent scar. And America, in its judging frenzy, stood around watching, snapping photos. gossiping, then walking away. Lawrence Taylor, the man who once made the nation fear, now became a symbol of the opposite, for society's cruelty to those once worshipped. An old man, eyes empty, surviving the very sentence the world gave him. If anything remains, it's the shame not just his, but all of ours, for having cheered, applauded, called him God, and then turned away, watching him destroyed like entertainment. Lawrence Taylor didn't die on the field. He died in the public eye, and the most tragic part, they're still watching, still applauding, after the verdict, after the headlines and millions of judging eyes. Lawrence Taylor did something he'd never known how to do his whole life: step back. No more stage, no more microphones, no more reporters, just silence, a silence heavy as an invisible prison sentence. He vanished from the public eye, from shows, from those he once called friends. The world thought he'd fallen, but in truth, for the first time in his life, Lawrence Taylor was learning to stand still. His body was tired, his mind empty, and the small house in Florida became a refuge for a warrior with no wars left. No more cheers, just the ticking of a clock, and the heavy breath of a man trying to survive his own shame. His children still visited, but their eyes were no longer innocent. They looked at him with both love and distance, especially his daughter, torn between two opposing images: the father who once made entire stadiums roar, and the man who vanished without a word. "He's so funny," his daughter said in an interview. "The whole room laughs when he's there. The problem is, he's not always there." A simple sentence, but it cut like a knife, because it spoke the truest truth. Lawrence Taylor had never truly been present in anyone's life, not even his children's. He lived for the noise, not knowing how to live for the quiet moments. And now, in old age, he had to learn to face that, not in a courtroom, but in a living room, with his daughter's eyes looking at him like a stranger. Family, once a wound, now became a mirror. Every time he looked at his kids, Lawrence didn't see pride, but guilt. He had missed too much birthdays, graduations, days they were sick. He remembered nights he chose white powder over tucking them in, music over their laughter. Once his daughter asked, "Do you remember when I learned to ride a bike?" Lawrence fell silent, because the answer was no, he wasn't there, and no apology could make up for that. Instead of trying to justify, Lawrence chose to do what he couldn't in his youth: listen. He listened to his kids' stories, to his own tears inside, to the wind on the porch, a sound he once thought meaningless, and in that silence, something began to change. Not fast, not obvious, but real. Lawrence stopped seeking to be loved, and started learning to love again, not with words, but with actions. In 2016, with his daughter, he started the Lawrence Taylor Family Foundation, a small fund aimed at kids and young athletes, those like he once was, teetering on the edge between glory and destruction. No more dazzling stages, just a small meeting room, a few old friends, a few papers, a few simple dreams. The day he signed the foundation's papers, his hand trembled, scars on his knuckles, standing out like wood grain. He looked up at his daughter, eyes cloudy but sincere. "If I'm still useful in this life, it's to stop another kid from becoming the worst version of me." His daughter cried, and he stayed silent, because some apologies, if spoken, ease the speaker but never the listener. There was no Hollywood redemption moment, no applause, no awards, no scene of a hero forgiven, just an old man, hunched, trying to atone by doing the smallest, most right thing each day. Mornings, he woke early, brewed coffee, did exercises to ease his back pain, then went to community centers to talk to recovering teens. He didn't preach, didn't play hero, he told his story. He spoke of nights he couldn't remember where he slept, of waking in jail with blood on his shirt, of kids too scared to call their dad. Each story was a knife reopening scars, but also a small bridge rebuilding what he'd lost: trust. Online, those who once cursed him grew quiet. Some fans sent letters, writing, "We still remember you on the field, but now we see you off it, and maybe that's the real victory." Lawrence didn't reply. He didn't need applause anymore. What he needed was his kids calling him dad without trembling. And the miracle, though slow, came. One afternoon, at a fundraising event, his daughter took the stage, looked at him and said, Today I'm not just standing next to a football legend, I'm standing next to my father." Lawrence bowed his head, tears falling. For the first time in decades, the applause didn't make him feel ashamed, it made him feel light. Time doesn't erase guilt, but it can turn guilt into meaning. Lawrence Taylor will never wash away what he did, and he knows it, but he doesn't hide anymore. He carries it, like his own cross. Every talk, every handshake, every dollar donated to a poor kid is an apology to those he hurt. He doesn't try to forget the past, he just tries to make it useful. A man once called a living weapon of destruction, now lives as a healer, not for himself, but for others. He still carries the offender label, still gets hesitant looks, but he's used to it. "I don't need forgiveness," he said in a 2022 interview. "I just need to be allowed to do the right thing before I die." It's not a clean redemption, it's a messy, painful one, smelling of drugs, sweat, tears and time, but it's real. And in Lawrence Taylor's world, where everything was once lies, illusions, adrenaline, real is the most valuable thing. No one can erase the scars on his name, but maybe they don't need to be erased, because sometimes a person's worth lies not in how many times they fall, but in what they choose to stand up for. Lawrence Taylor chose to stand not for applause, but to keep others from falling like he did. And in that choice, he finally found what he'd been lost from all his life, a reason to be called by his name. 60 came to Lawrence Taylor, not as a rest, but as a suspended sentence. His body, once a weapon, once a legend, now stood as living evidence of the crimes of American sports worship. Each step was a beat of pain. Each morning, a new battle. When the wind shifted, his neck stiffened like rusted steel. His knees creaked, as if glass shards were inside. His back occasionally bit with electric jolts, forcing him to freeze mid-step, hand clutching the wall to avoid falling. The tackles from years ago, those plays that made stadiums roar, now returned one by one, silent, relentless, cruel. Chronic pain replaced adrenaline. No more cheers, just the heavy breath of a man who once saw pain as a companion, now learning to endure it as an unkillable enemy. His memory, too, began to fray. The hundreds of head collisions from years past didn't just damage bones, they fogged his brain. Some days mid-conversation, he'd stop, unable to recall what he meant to say. Once he forgot the name of the person in front of him. "I still remember how to tackle, but sometimes forget how to leave a room," he once said, half joking, half true. It wasn't just aging, it was the aftermath of war, a war he won with his body, but lost with his soul. Many nights, Lawrence lay still in bed, eyes wide staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Pain ran down his spine like someone plugged electricity into his bones. He still heard collisions in his head, the clang of metal, the cadence of calls, his own panting breath from 30 years ago. He still smelled sweat, bandages, the burn of artificial turf under cleats. For others, football had ended. For Lawrence Taylor, it just moved house from MetLife Stadium to inside his body. The war wasn't over, it just changed masks. No more crowds, no reporters, no lights, just a chair, a few painkillers, a few doctor's appointments, and mornings waking to the question, why am I still here when so many others didn't make it this far? Many of his peers had died of heart failure, brain damage, overdoses on pain meds. Yet Lawrence was still here, amid nameless pain, as if fate forced him to survive to remember. Some mornings, he stepped onto the porch, watching Florida sunlight filter through his weathered skin, whispering, "Maybe this is the final punishment, to live and feel every crack I caused." Yet even in pain, Lawrence Taylor kept showing up. He still attended community events, fundraisers, charity programs for young athletes. In front of cameras, he still smiled, shook hands, wore the iconic gold Hall of Fame jacket, America's immortal glory. But under that fabric, his heart beat slow and heavy, his back ached, his hands trembled from meds. Each smile was a pang, each long stand required gritted teeth. When everyone left, he sat, quietly rubbing his knees, taking off the jacket, breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "They see the legend," he once whispered to an old friend, "but they don't know this legend hasn't slept a full night in years." Pain became his new biological clock. It woke him at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., never late. He got up, turned on the light, paced slowly, hand on his back, eyes shut, muttering prayers. Not for health, but for patience, to endure another day. Doctors told him to move less, but how do you explain to a man who lived his life in motion that stillness is the punishment? Sometimes, he turned on the TV, watching old footage. A young fiery Lawrence Taylor charging opponents, blood-smeared smile, eyes of a god. Then he'd turn it off, look away, because in those images, he saw not victory, but the slow death that began there. Back then, I was immortal, he said, and that's what killed me. His body is now like a ruined museum, each joint a crack, each nerve a broken string. He carries metal, artificial cartilage, crisscrossed scars. Painkillers are his companion. Some days he takes 5 kinds just to get out of bed. Some afternoons, he stares at the pill bottle, at his trembling hand, and wonders, if I stop, will I still be me? Loneliness hurts no less. Friends dwindled, some gone, others unwilling to revisit the past. He sits alone, in a room full of old photos, Bill Parcells, Belichick, former teammates, faces forever young in frames, while he ages, weathers, trembles. Each photo is a soft stab. No one understands that surviving is sometimes harder than dying. Yet, in all this, Lawrence keeps a strange humility. Now, when invited to speak, he doesn't talk titles or victories. He talks pain, drugs, broken sleep. America called me immortal, he says, but immortality isn't a reward, it's a punishment. Because you're not allowed to forget. You carry it all. The room falls silent. Because no one expects a legend to say that. Lawrence Taylor doesn't complain. He just lives. One day, one pain, one shaky step at a time. Each morning, he still goes to the small backyard field, looks at the sun, tries to lightly kick an old football. His back hurts, but his lips curl slightly, because at least, despite the decay, his heart still beats, a slow, weak beat, but real. And perhaps that's the most tragic manifesto America ever created. America called him immortal, but now America witnesses the true cost of that immortality. A body no longer at peace. Lawrence Taylor still lives, but no one dares call it surviving. Because sometimes, living long is the final torture glory reserves for those it once chose. Lawrence Taylor, a name that when mentioned revives an entire era of American football. The man who forced quarterbacks to change their game, made the league rewrite the playbook to protect that position, turned linebacker into a symbol of fear, a warrior, a force of nature in human form. He changed the NFL forever, turning defense into an art of disciplined destruction. But at the same time, that same Lawrence Taylor was the one who made America bow its head in shame, the addict, the handcuffed man. The one standing in a courtroom hearing charges related to sex, the one looking at his trembling hands and wondering why he's still alive. Within the same man existed both extremes, eternal light and darkness that never fades. And then after it all, there's a third Lawrence Taylor, less glamorous but more real. A 66-year-old man, no longer deluded by immortality, no longer believing in miracles, just trying to pour what's left of his life into kids who haven't yet burned out like he did. A man who no longer needs the flash of cameras, only kids willing to hear him say, "Don't take my path." At 66, Lawrence is no longer the beast of the gridiron. He's a man who walks slowly, speaks slowly, smiles slowly. He still shows up at community gatherings, still wears the faded gold Hall of Fame jacket, still smiles and signs autographs. But behind the smile are sleepless nights from back pain, fitful dreams haunted by echoes of the past. People see the icon. He feels every crack in his bones, a reminder that glory is never free. Now Lawrence Taylor no longer tries to prove anything to anyone. He just wants to leave behind something better than his name, a chance, a warning, a hand pulling back young souls rushing toward the edge he once fell from. In every talk with young athletes, he doesn't speak of victories. He speaks of loss. He speaks of waking up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, not knowing who you are. He says glory can lift you high, but one mistake can hurl you into the abyss faster than light. And this is where the storyteller and America must face the real question: how will you remember him? A fallen man, a flawed god, or a human who lived long enough to tell the world the truth. Glory doesn't save you, fame doesn't save you, money doesn't save you. If no one pulls you back from the edge, you won't be here to tell the story. One afternoon at a community event in Florida, a boy approached, eyes bright and innocent, holding out an old football for a signature. "Mr. Taylor, do you have any regrets?" the boy asked, voice trembling. Lawrence paused, his pen-holding hand shaking more than usual, his back pain forcing him to hunch. He looked at the boy for a long moment, then said softly, voice catching, "I regret letting my pain hurt others, but I don't regret surviving long enough to tell you that." The boy fell silent, and Lawrence signed, his handwriting shaky, uneven like his life, flawed, but real. As the boy walked away, Lawrence sat alone, watching the football disappear into the crowd. The Florida breeze blew warm, but something glistened in his eyes. Maybe sadness, maybe gratitude, maybe both. He had lived longer than fate allowed, and he knew the only thing left wasn't records or fame, but meaning. When night falls, Lawrence Taylor, once an immortal legend, sits in his quiet house, listening to the old pain return. But this time, he doesn't fight it. He lets it stay, like an uninvited old friend. Because, in the end, he understands the things that once tormented him are also what kept him alive. Memories, mistakes, and the courage to face them all. And for those who see him only as a sinner or a fallen saint, remember this: Lawrence Taylor paid a price no one else dared, to show us the underside of a legend. Leave a thank you for the man who endured in our place. Cherish legends while they're still alive, not just when they're gone. Because sometimes, the only way to honor a hero isn't to build a statue, but to listen when they say, "I fell, but I'm still here." Lawrence Taylor's story isn't a sports story. It's a story about America, who we exalt, what we demand of them, and where we leave them when the applause dies. We watched a black kid from Williamsburg, Virginia, grow up in a working-class family where weakness was suicide, turning rage into a survival engine. He stormed the NFL in 1981, winning Defensive Rookie of the Year and Defensive Player of the Year in the same season, then claiming MVP in 1986, a linebacker doing what no one else could. He forced the league to rewrite how to protect quarterbacks. He sacrificed his body, playing with cracked ankles, torn shoulders, blood seeping through bandages, numbed by injections before returning to the battlefield. We called it glory, but the truth is, it was also self-destruction, and that's where the tragedy began. When the games ended, Lawrence couldn't turn off the noise in his head. Cocaine, crack, alcohol didn't come after fame, they walked hand in hand with it. Home was no longer home, wife and kids no longer family, they became helpless witnesses watching him vanish night after night. Then came the moment America watched him stand, head bowed, in court, labeled an offender, a man once called a living weapon of destruction, now judged like damaged goods. We, this society, turned the camera on his weakest moment, and called it news. But he didn't die there. At 66, with a back that stabs like lightning, knees like glass, memory faltering, he still tries to rise with his daughter, starting a family foundation to pull other kids from the edge he fell from. When a boy asked, "Do you have regrets?" he answered, "I regret letting my pain hurt others, but I don't regret surviving long enough to tell you that." The lesson for us isn't don't make mistakes. Every American makes mistakes. The lesson is don't exalt someone to godhood until they must destroy themselves to meet our expectations, and don't bury them alive just because they fell. A hero isn't someone clean. A hero is someone who still finds a way to be useful, even carrying a courtroom, a stigma, and pain on their back. If Lawrence Taylor's story makes you believe that even legends need understanding and forgiveness, leave a subscription to join us in telling more stories of the humans behind the glory. Thank you for listening to the end. See you in the next video, where we continue to honor the warriors who fell but never stopped rising.